Harry Douglas, Roddy White, and Julio
Yep.
Jones are beloved wide receiver trio of the past. They launched a new podcast. It's called The Legacy Locker Room. For those of you that haven't checked it out, please go do so. There's a lot of cool info on there and just nostalgic watching those three together. Um, During the first episode, Jeff, Roddy White dropped the bombshell. He said on that first episode that Kyle Shanahan told him that he wasn't a top four option on that offense in 2015. He went on to further say that if the game was on the line, the ball would go to Jacob Tamme or Leonard Hankerson over him. You've talked about how bad that relationship was on older episodes in the past, Jeff. But does that kind of comment like line up with your expectations? Because even Julio Jones was visibly in disbelief when Roddy White spoke about that. So does this kind of make sense for you? Does that line up with everything you've heard during that era?
Oh yeah, yeah, no doubt. I mean, there, that, and it, you almost hear that, and you're like, holy shit, right? Like, how does a guy like Kyle Shanahan? I mean, even if you believe that Roddy's on the tail end of his career, and he was, like, there's no doubt about that. He wasn't a one or a two, but to say that a guy like Leonard Hankerson or a guy like Jacob Tamme is who you would throw the ball to, instead of a guy like Roddy White, who you go back and look, and I've done it during his era. Roddy White was a top five wide receiver in the NFL, and he's probably one of the most disrespected players of his time. And he got outshined because you had Tony, because you had Julio. But put some respect on my man's name. You know what I mean? Like he's and just kind of I've met him a couple of times. He's a lot smaller in person than you think he is, but that to me just goes to show how hard he worked and how good he actually was coming out of UAB. And uh, I feel like that was, to answer your question. Yeah, I mean that's everything that I've heard. It's things that I've talked about routinely over the years. Um, but for a coach in the NFL, especially a guy who seems to be as respected as Kyle Shanahan is, maybe he's a daddy hire. I mean, there's probably a lot of argument to that. Being Shanahan, Mike Shanahan's kid. But for you to come out and tell a guy like Roddy, who still had something left, and say, yeah, I'd rather throw it to my fourth tight end, or my sixth wide receiver, is absolutely absurd. And it just goes to show how dysfunctional Kyle Shanahan was. And to me, actually goes on to show just how good Matt Ryan was to get that team to a Super Bowl with all of that dysfunction going on in that locker room. Because when you tell a guy like Roddy White, you're garbage, which is exactly basically what he told him. That doesn't go over well in the locker room because Roddy was extremely respected in that locker room. He was extremely loved in that locker room. He was the elder statesman. That locker room belonged to Matt, Julio, and Tony. Right, like and you can probably put them in a hierarchy if you wanted to, but Roddy had been here the longest. Roddy was a Southern kid. Bled for the Falcons, went through hell with the Falcons. Let's not forget he was here that tail end for Michael Vick, his rookie year, and then went through that garbage of, what's his name from Oregon, and then Louisville, and
Harrington,
yeah,
Leftwich, Redmond.
all of that nonsense, and then had a guy like Matt Ryan to resurrect his career and actually went and he put up some absolute ridiculous numbers. And so for him to be disrespected like that and not for a guy like Roddy to not get his flowers and to not be able to go out on his terms, I think is just a true travesty. In the light sense of the word, obviously, there's a lot of travesty in this world. An NFL player not getting to retire how he wanted to, I understand that. But in the text of what we're talking about here, for a guy like that to not be able to get the respect and be able to have the send off that he earned and deserved, it obviously here we are 10 years later, and it still pisses him off, as it should.
Jeff, Roddy is my all-time favorite Falcon. If we ever get humongous one day, if this thing blows up and we're interviewing actual Falcons players, I think he's the one guy where I would have my meltdown moment with. Everybody else, I'd be cool with Matt. I'd be cool with Julio. Like I wouldn't, go fanboy all over them. But with Roddy White, I don't think I would hold my composure. He has a special for me. Like the one thing about him that I truly appreciated, like as a fan, was there was interest for him after he was cut in 2015 to go play for another team, but he just bled red and black. He couldn't do it. And as a fan, like, how could you not like that guy? How could you not like, he is everything that a player should be in our organization. So, I mean, hearing that, Jeff, hearing what Kyle Shanahan did to him at a time where, let's not kid ourselves, he was probably a nepotism hire because he wasn't Kyle Shanahan yet. He was fired from the Cleveland staff. Let's not forget that, right? He was the OC for Cleveland with Johnny Football, fired, and now joining the Falcons. Like this, if it didn't go well for him, if we didn't all of a sudden hit the Super Bowl in his second year as OC, like he might still be an OC today. So like he caught lightning in a bottle, and for you to walk in, for you to discredit a fan favorite and someone that actually, to your point, still had a lot of gas left in the tank, like that just pisses me off. As if it wasn't bad enough for calling such a shitty Super Bowl and caught like now we're the butt of every joke. Anytime we get into a freaking argument with anybody on X, in the back pocket of the opposing fan base is that 28-3 comeback. And that's all Kyle, man. That's all Kyle. And it gets my blood boiling. But speaking of that Super Bowl, Jeff, in that podcast, Julio Jones mentioned, how did we not run the ball? You even know it in Pee Wee football. 3rd and 1, we're up 16. Run the damn ball. Just run the ball. He said it multiple times. And obviously, the play that he's referencing is that 3rd and 1 strip sack play. Jeff, it seems like Julio might also have a bone to pick with Kyle Shanahan as well. Am I reading into his comments too much there?
No, I think he here we are 9 years later. I think he actually subtly took shots at Shanahan and Matt Ryan, if I'm being honest with you. But to your point, this specific audio you're talking about, he said, my entire time in Atlanta, 3rd and 1, we ran the ball. That's who we were. He's like, that's what we always did. And there was a lot of different OCs during his time here. Because basic football, 3rd and 1, especially with a game like that, you run the fucking football, right? And everybody can say, and I always hate bringing this up. Why? Because people are always like, well, Matt should have changed the call. And Kyle Shanahan and DQ have come out a million times and talked about how Kyle Shanahan, even to this day in San Francisco, does not allow for quarterbacks to change the play call. I think people got spoiled watching guys like Tom Brady and Drew Brees and Peyton Manning and Aaron Rodgers and all the other elite quarterbacks change plays, but they had OCs that allowed them to do so. They didn't do it because they could. They did it because they had OCs that gave them the opportunity to do it. And Kyle Shanahan has said many times, no matter who his quarterback is, you don't get to change my play. You look at that but I think what was really kind of, I forgot who it was in that podcast, but they talked about how Tevin Coleman had gotten hurt the play or two before that. And, he would have been the bigger of the two running backs. And he, does that change that play call at that point? And you really have to kind of wonder if that does. I'm sure like I'm sure you probably echo this. Let's not spend too much time on this because this shit's not going to change 10 years later. But yeah, like they obviously are still really upset they didn't get that ring. Are they upset for the same reasons we are? For me, I'm upset that ring wasn't here in Atlanta. That trophy's not here in Atlanta because Matt Ryan still has to answer the not good enough question. He's going to answer that, 5 years from now when his name's on that ballot for the first time. So, those guys wanted rings. Those guys played for championships, and those guys really wanted to win one for the city of Atlanta. Right. And there are a lot of guys out there who wish they had won Super Bowls for themselves. For me, I really feel like Julio wanted to win one, obviously for himself, but for the city of Atlanta. And even though this city kind of turned on him after that trade, he has never turned his back on the city of Atlanta. He retired on 404 day. He continues to be around Atlanta. He's still, he's an Atlanta guy, even though he didn't grow up here, obviously from Alabama. But that's a guy who only continued to play because he felt like he had something in the tank. Although I will say, I think Falcons fans need to realize that he left here in Atlanta, maybe before he wanted to, but at the right time, because he had nothing left in that tank when he left here.
Yeah, for sure. And the fact that he's even mentoring Penix now, that's awesome. That's music to my ears. I hope Roddy, finds his way on the field with the receivers too. Like those guys are the two role models that I want, Penix to look up to, Drake London to look up to. They've been there, done that. Obviously couldn't complete the final chapter of their careers, but still were very successful and beloved in the city of Atlanta. Jeff, just rewinding the tape back to that play with Tevin Coleman, I think that's the play that's least talked about in the Super Bowl. Even Bill Belichick in his new book, The Art of Winning, basically said one of the things that we noticed pregame is when Atlanta was only carrying two running backs into the 45-man roster, that kind of like set an alarm bell in him and Matt Patricia's head. He went on to say that Devontae Freeman struggled to pick up the blitz. So the moment that Tevin Coleman went down on that second and whatever run call, they knew that when they put Freeman in, we're sending Hightower, that linebacker, off the blitz against him. And obviously, Freeman famously didn't pick him up. He looked the other way, and strip sack was caused. But let's not waste too much time on it. We were out coached.
But I also want to say that part of that book, though, is he talks about how Hightower took it upon himself because he watched the film, and Hightower put himself in that position, and he just talked about how smart of a player he was too, right? Yep. And so, you almost have to go back and wonder how many tendencies that Kyle Shanahan put on fucking film that these guys basically knew, when a personnel, because guys get hurt all the time, personnel groupings change, but how bad was
how predictable was Kyle Shanahan? Is that what you're trying to get at?
Right. How predictable was he? How bad was your stable of running backs that these guys knew with your group personnel packings exactly what was coming, right? And it's just I mean, the more that comes out about that game, the more pissed off I get all over again.
Yeah, let's switch to another topic that might get your blood boiling too. We've talked about him on past podcasts too, and we're staying with the legacy locker room agenda. There's a lot that came out in that podcast that I mean, we could spend an episode just breaking that podcast down in its entirety. But last thing on that, Jeff, there was a moment there where they were talking about how Tony G in 2012, after that season, was kind of contemplating retirement. So he hadn't committed going into training camp or whatever. And he showed up the last day, and basically Roddy, Julio, and everyone else, they've been practicing in that Georgia heat all summer long. Tony G comes the last day, and Mike Smith, Smitty, asked Tony G to break down the huddle. And that seemed to really piss off Julio Jones in the podcast. He visibly looked upset and still pissed off about that. Like, how could this guy just walk in there and break down the huddle after not practicing all of training camp? And they went on, and Roddy said that, like, during training camp too, like, Tony kind of didn't really have like some self-awareness, because that was a time where Twitter was getting really popular, and apparently, like, he was out in the bars in Atlanta drinking. Like, he was getting pictures posted of him on Twitter while these guys are training for the season. Jeff, was there? I know Tony G was a leader in the locker room, but was there even a little bit of animosity between our star players and Tony G?
So I even talked about this back in 2013 when this happened. That this was a really bad idea. And I think part of the story that Roddy and Julio didn't mention was Mike Smith had given Tony Gonzalez permission to miss camp. And that was widely publicized, everybody knew that he was not, and the reason for that was one, it was like year 20 for him or year 19 for him, and so the thought process with Mike Smith was, hey, he's a veteran, we trust him to come into camp, in shape, ready to go. And, Tony had asked for permission, if I'm not mistaken, Gonzalez had asked for permission to miss training camp because his oldest son was playing football and he wanted to be there during that season for his, the first season his son played football, and so they agreed that he could miss training camp, and he showed up that last week. And I think when you look across and you hear it now, that obviously didn't sit well with the younger guys on the team, right? Like that, obviously there was a lot of animosity because for the things that you just pointed out. It's hot as shit here in the summer. I don't know if you've ever been to Atlanta in the summertime. It's hot as shit in July and August, right? It's like 95, 100, 105. It's 90, 95, 98% humidity. So it's hot and it's gross. And those guys are out there at, 10 o'clock, 3 o'clock, in those 3 o'clock practices, that's high, that's high noon, right? Like the sun's at its brightest. It's the hottest temperature of the day. And so, yeah, I'm sure that those young guys, because they were all young in 2013. I'm sure they didn't take kindly to having to be out there while the guy that ended up wearing a captaincy on his chest was back in California, hanging with his family, watching his kid play football. And so I talked about it then. I remember, we talked about it on 92.9 because I had been there for about 3 or 4 months at that time. It was a really big topic here because all of us couldn't believe that Mike Smith had said, yeah, you're good. Because I think the other part that they probably didn't take too kindly to was Tony basically said, hey, either you do this or I retire. And, the threat of losing a guy like that essentially last minute obviously didn't sit well. And so I think there was probably a lot of animosity for how he handled that. And, for me, just as a quick side story, when I first got into radio, I was a executive producer for a guy by the name of Ron Barr. Ron is headquartered out of San Francisco. He owns and runs a company called Sports Byline USA. It's been around for almost 40 years. Ron was on all the early EA Sports video games. He was the voice of the NHL hockey game that was really loved. He's in the Broadcasting Hall of Fame. He's got 60,000 interviews in the Library of Congress. And so my job for him was to book guests. And the first guy he had me call back in 2013 actually was Tony Gonzalez. I don't know if I've told this story before, but I called Tony. I had his cell phone number. I called him. He said, hello, who is this? I introduced myself, and he goes, why the fuck are you calling me? The verbatim is exactly, and I told him what I was calling for. I told him I was trying to get him to do an interview for the Library of Congress. He said, good, call my fucking assistant, idiot. And he hung up the phone. And we ended up having to go through the Falcons during the season to get him. But that was my lone interaction with Tony. So obviously it wasn't a good one. Definitely not all of some of the nice things I've heard about, what a nice guy he is. That was obviously not my impression of him. And listening to that podcast this week, I kind of got the feeling that he wasn't all that well loved at the end of his tenure here in Atlanta either.
Yeah, you told me that story off camera. I didn't know that you were gonna go there, so I started cracking up. But I mean that's wild, man. I mean, the thing is, like, some people are like really play up to that celebrity status, and Tony seems to be one of those guys. But then you look at probably someone like Roddy or even Julio, and they see. I don't know. I can tell Roddy's probably a little more relaxed in that. I don't know about Julio, to be frank, but yeah, it's just wild to me to kind of have that kind of reaction when you're that big. But it is what it is, man. These guys get tons of requests too, so it's hard to read too much into that. But yeah, that was a really fun story, Jeff. I'm glad you shared that during your time there in 2013.